Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. I am your host, Lonnie Jones. My wife Jackie and I moved to the city of Huntsville in 1986 for me to be a youth and family minister. I have been a minister since 1980. I have served in this community as a police chaplain assigned to a SWAT team since 1992, and I've been in private practice as a licensed professional counselor since 1998. I'm also an adventure educator and an avid outdoorsman. I dabble in rock climbing and I goof around with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Our life has been full of many wonderful experiences and some just outright adventures. I used to write about those things in a little church bulletin article. So now instead of asking you to read those things, we're just going to talk about them in our podcast. And as we talk about them, we're going to talk about the facts. The facts lead to concepts, and the concepts lead to application. One caveat about the facts is, for the most part, we're going to tell you the facts just as they happened. But every now and then, we're going to tell you the way other people have told us they remember it happening with a little bit of embellishment. It's all good, clean fun and for educational purposes. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy Keeping Up with Jones. Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure, is sponsored by SJ&L General Contractors. They are licensed in both Alabama and Tennessee, and they provide services such as mass grading, storm drainage, sewer and concrete improvement, asphalt paving, erosion control, demolition, and heavy hauling. If you need any of these services, contact them 931-433-4660, 931-433-4660. Also, they are in need of heavy equipment operators, concrete finishers, CDL dump truck drivers, and pipe layers. If you're interested in employment with this family-owned business, you can go to the website www.sjnl.com. That's www.sjnl.com. I was in Oxford, Alabama last Sunday. The Church of Christ that I grew up in had invited me to come and speak at their vacation Bible school, and I went into the auditorium and I sat in the middle section on the second row to the left, and that's where I sat as a boy. I sat there with Carrie and with Beth and with Bobby and with Drew and with Neil and with Paul and with Sammy and Tommy and my brother Gerald and Kenny. And I spoke, and I was well received, and went back to my mom and dad's house. And we had spent the afternoon with mom and dad, but I had to be back for some stuff on Monday. And so we got in the car and we drove out. And it was raining. It was dark, and it was raining. And we're talking, this is in July. And I remarked to my wife, I said, this reminds me of driving at Christmas with the rain falling and it being dark. And in the intersection, I think of Snow Street and Quintard Avenue, I looked over where the little Hardys stood. And I had a repressed memory from childhood about that little Hardys on a very cold, wet winter evening. I worked at Hardee's when I turned 16. I was a cashier, and I'd asked the boss. Well, when I got hired, my friend had introduced me to the boss, and when I came in to apply for the job, he looked at me and said, "Well, what size uniform pants do you wear? Size 3 dwarf?" He thought he was hilarious. And after I got the job, I ended up being one of the guys who worked late and would often stay for closing and do the cleanup. I had requested of this guy that I be allowed to work on the Fridays and the Saturdays when everybody else wanted to be off, so that I could be off on Sundays and Wednesdays so I could attend Bible class and church. I was committed to my faith and didn't want to ever miss my church services. And so, yeah, I worked the weekends. Now, one weekend when we were cleaning up, he began with this dwarf stuff again, and I was employed, and I had asked him not to call me a dwarf. I'm technically not one, but he continued, and I put him on my shoulders and carried him outside and military pressed him into a dumpster. I wasn't ever called a dwarf again, at least not in my hearing. But he wasn't there this night. I was the only guy in the store. The football crowd had come and gone, and it was getting close to time to close, and I was the only guy there. And she walked in out of the darkness. And if I use the term exotic, you probably won't have the right image in your mind, but that's the only term I can use is exotic. Now, you got to understand that as a 16-year-old boy, you can use the term exotic about females. But you also have to understand that I went to high school with Carrie Kelly and Marsha Carter and Camille Baxter and Gina Sparks and Cindy Warren. And all the girls at our school were pretty, but the girls at Oxford High School in the class of 1981 and above, they were exceptionally pretty. And this girl was a different animal. This was a different species. This was something as a boy I'd never seen before. And she was dressed very differently than the girls that I went to school with. There was nothing dirty on TV. There was no Cinemax or Showtime or HBO. So we were pretty sheltered and pretty limited on what you saw. But when this girl walked in out of the darkness, it was exotic. She had very expensive high heel shoes on, and I don't know how I knew they were expensive as a boy, but they were different than anything I'd ever saw anybody else wear. And her skirt was incredibly short, and the vest that she wore as a top was incredibly small. There was more of her exposed than there was clothing on her, and she had 2 tattoos on her top. And I distinctly remember they were roses. And I'm standing behind the counter in a goofy paper hat and a Hardee's uniform, and this exotic creature just appeared. I didn't see the vehicle that she got out of. I didn't see who dropped her off. And she walked in the door and she sat down in a booth. And it's midnight, and I'm the only guy in the building, and I asked, would she just simply like something to drink, and she acquiesced, and I made a Coke out of the fountain and climbed over the counter and sat down in the booth across from her. I was as much starstruck as I was mesmerized, and we did not have a conversation. She did not go to school. She was not in a band. She had not been a cheerleader. She did not talk about music or sports or track or anything that I'd ever talk to any other girl about. And she was absolutely not interested and was definitely not impressed by a boy who climbed trees for fun. And I sat there in the awkwardness of the whole thing, realizing that I was absolutely, totally inadequate, but feeling this, I don't know, just feeling this need to connect with this creature. And we sat there in the awkwardness until the limousine pulled up. And when the limousine pulled up, she gathered the very tiny little thing that would have passed for a purse. And she looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen in my life. And she said, I'm almost sure it would be enjoyable to spend some time with a nice boy. And she walked out into the cold darkness and got into the limousine and disappeared. I had been regulated to number one being nice, which probably means harmless. And I'd also been labeled as a boy. I was as unsophisticated as she was sophisticated. I was as generic and she was exotic. And I was as naive as she was worldly. And at first I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed by my own inadequacy. It's like the first time you're around somebody who really is sophisticated, or the first time you talk to somebody who's really educated. I can remember sitting in Dr. Jones's class at Harding and understanding the depth of knowledge he had about the Bible. I remember being a freshman Greek student and realizing I didn't know anything about anything when Dr. McKinney would explain the parsing of Greek verbs. I was as embarrassed, but I was angry. Because even in my unsophistication and even in my naivete, I did not think that the exotic girl wanted to get in the limousine. But she did. And it wasn't robotic and it wasn't sluggish. She stood and with as much poise as you can step into disaster or tragedy, she did. She just got up, gathered her purse, said to what I believe now was something very nice to me. And she walked out into that dark and got into that limousine, and they didn't open the door for her. No one came in to get, she just went like a pet who'd been called. I don't know what she was. I don't know if she was a professional or a prisoner. I don't know if that was my first encounter with human trafficking. I can't begin to tell you how old or how young she was. She was at least my age, but she looked much older, and her eyes were ancient. And even in her exotic physical beauty, the shape of her body and the expense of her clothes, she did not compare to the girls that I was in school with. Because all my girls that were my friends, their eyes had life in them. There's this sparkle, this energy. That's what I fell in love with Jackie about. It was her eyes. And that when she smiled, the world just illuminated. But this exotic creature did not have the eyes that my friends had. They did not have the eyes of a child. They really didn't have the eyes of a person. I was angry because I was powerless, I think. I don't have any idea what became of her. But I recognized that night that even had she looked at me and said, I need your help. If she had looked at me and said, I don't want to go, I'm not sure how I could have responded. I think now about walking into the little house on Williamson Street after midnight with this girl and seeing my mother's face. But she didn't ask me for help. And had she asked me for help, had she said, I don't want to get into the limousine, I believe I would have tried to prevent that. But I also believe that as a 16-year-old boy, I would have been utterly powerless to do it. I don't know who else was in the limousine, but they were probably wealthy and they were probably large and they were probably armed. That's one of those moments in your life that you never tell about. I don't know that I've ever told anybody about it. But the other night, driving in the dark in the rain with my beautiful wife, passing that little store, it's not even a Hardee's anymore. Passing that location, that thought came to me that there are people, there are children, there are women, there are boys, there are people in bad circumstances, and the light has gone out of their eyes. And even though they may have beautiful bodies and exotic clothing, they're not really living. And I don't know if they can't ask for help or they won't ask for help or if they just don't believe that they can be helped. And this is similar to the warrior poem that we read several episodes ago, but I think something inside, I don't know if it formed or broke. I didn't want to feel helpless. I didn't want to feel inadequate. I did not want to ever feel powerless. And I wanted to help the helpless. And I wanted to assist the weak. And I wanted to strengthen and uplift the fallen. But I think back to that cold, dark, rainy night when a boy crossed paths with something far outside of his league. And it's not that she was so much more sophisticated than me or so much more mature than me or so much more worldly than me. But I recognized that what was going on there. And when she got up and walked out that door and got into that limousine, I recognized that there was a level of evil that I had not encountered before. Not a bully at school or the potheads who smoked weed or even the people who were prejudiced or the people who lied or the guys who were sleeping with their girlfriends or the girls who were sleeping with their boyfriends, the things that I didn't approve of and the things I tried to avoid. That's what I thought evil was. That's what I thought sin was. Boy, this was different. And I was overwhelmed. And maybe it wasn't anger. Maybe it was just, I was ashamed. I was ashamed because I didn't even know how to begin to try to help. I couldn't even have a conversation with her, much less rescue her. And she got up. She gathered her little purse. And with a straight back and the poise of a runway model. She walked out into the darkness and crawled into that limousine and disappeared. Garth Brooks has a song, and one of the lines of his song talks about the cold winter and the snow drifts getting 10 feet tall. And the song has a line that says, and I spent a long time thinking about the ones the wolves pulled down. I don't have any answers, but I dedicate this podcast simply to the ones the wolves pulled down. There are 32 miles of cave passages in Cumberland Cavern. 333 feet underground is the Volcano Room. The Volcano Room is the site for the youth rally known as Erupt. It's an underground youth rally. It's an annual event. It takes place in October. The next Erupt is scheduled for October of 2021. Erupt is a sponsor of Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. If you'd like more information, you may contact them at eruptyouithrally@gmail.com. That's eruptyouithrally@gmail.com. Or check out their website for more information, 3 W's and a dot, eruptyouithrally.com, www.eruptyouithrally.com.